say thank you to everyone for joining us. Good evening. Thank you. Welcome. My name is Ed Potasnik. I'm Executive Director here with New Jersey League of Conservation Voters. We're very happy to have you with us. What is going to be an exciting evening, a little fireside chat as the winter has come upon us. It seems very fitting to get together and have a conversation about a really important topic, which is climate change. And just make sure we have a chance to understand on the cutting edge of science what's happening and what we all can do to prevent the worst of the climate crisis. So before we get started, some quick housekeeping. And I know that we're all probably Zoom experts by now, but some logistics for tonight. It would be nice to be able to refer to you by your name if you have a question or anything like that. So if you're using a computer or some other device that is used by someone else, your name may be different. So in the upper right-hand corner, there's 3 little dots. If you click those and then click rename, you can actually rename yourself so that we know who you are. And that's really helpful. In addition, if you need technical support, please send a message in the chat box anytime this evening. Sam is with us. She's going to be here and able to help. And with that, I just want to say thank you and welcome and turn it over to Cameron, who has helped organize the evening.
Thank you for that, Ed. And we will get rolling here in just a second. Just going to give people another minute or two to join in case of any late arrivals, and then we'll get the show on the road here. And just to echo Ed there, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. And this is an important topic we're talking about, so thank you. You beat me to that, Ed. Okay, let's get started here. People will join as we go. So good evening, everyone. My name is Cameron Ewan. I'm the Federal Climate Campaign intern here at the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters. I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for joining us this evening for our virtual fireside chat. I hope you all had a lovely Thanksgiving and that you're all staying safe and healthy. Tonight, we'll be discussing the Buildback Better Act, clean energy work in New Jersey, and climate change. We're joined tonight by climate scientist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Dr. John Krasting, and Executive Director of the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters, Ed Potasnik. Born and raised in New Jersey, Ed grew up fishing, swimming, and boating in the waters of the Garden State. And after a decade in the classroom teaching chemistry, Ed was awarded a highly competitive Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellowship to serve on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where he crafted policies designed to improve our nation's health and competitiveness. Ed is not only the executive director of the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters, he also serves as chair of the Keep It Green Coalition, working to sustain funding for the preservation and stewardship of New Jersey's natural resources, as well as he's on the board of Sustainable New Jersey. Ed is a member of the Franklin Township Board of Education, where he was formerly board president, and he was recently elected to the Township Council in Franklin Township, Ward 1. As a fun note, he's also a member of the Rutgers Glee Club Alumni Advisory Committee. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Ed, to introduce our special guest this evening, Dr. John Krasting.
Awesome. So before I turn it over to our guest speaker, which we're excited to have with us, I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been working on at New Jersey LCV while we have everyone together. Basically, a legislative cycle in New Jersey is 2 years. And every 2 years, we get together with all of our partner organizations in the environmental movement and organizations working on the ground to put together a legislative agenda to move through the New Jersey Assembly and the New Jersey Senate to send to the governor to become law. And basically, last year we put together 5 legislative priorities that we announced in December of 2019, because again, it's a 2-year cycle. And really knew nothing about what was going to hit us with the pandemic that was coming within months. I am proud to say that we continue to do our work and make great progress for the environment, for New Jersey's residents, for our children and grandchildren. And I want to tell you a little bit about them. So the first thing that we worked on was, keeping our eye on the ball to protect public health and make sure that we really get a chance to address pollution in vulnerable communities, communities of color that are more negatively impacted by pollution, because a lot of times the polluting sources are located there. And there was a bill called the Cumulative Impacts Legislation, which would allow communities of color for the first time to say no to projects that pollute their air, water, and land. And that was something that was supported by New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and a number of other organizations. And we played, that was leadership role by those groups, and we played a supportive role. We also worked in the transportation sector, which is the largest emitter in greenhouse gases and air pollution that we have to tackle in New Jersey on electric vehicle legislation to put us on a path to getting 330,000 electric vehicles on the roads of New Jersey by 2030. And it also electrified all of New Jersey transit buses by the year 2035, which is awesome. And we're also working on electric school bus, but that was a piece of legislation that was signed into law. And then folks are familiar, because now when we go to the out to eat, we're not getting straws unless we ask for them. At least we're not supposed to be. But that was part of a big bill that we passed to reduce plastics. It's called the Plastics Reduction Act. And it not only bans plastic straws, but also soon in May, it'll ban plastic and paper bags at the grocery store, because the best way to take your groceries home is the thing you forget, which is in your trunk or your closet, and that's the reusable bags. So make sure you start using those and get in that habit, because they're going to be gone come May. And then in addition, the plastic clamshell containers and all those take-home wasteful containers, those will go by the wayside as well. And we have 2 bills left for us to try to get across the finish line, and something called lame duck, which we're in right now. One of them is something we call energy efficient appliance standards. So we want to take the energy hog appliances that are on store shelves, use them up, and then not put them back again. And if we get rid of all of these energy hog appliances, we'll save ratepayers $130 million a year in electricity they don't need to use for things that cost about the same amount. So it's like sort of a no-brainer bill, but nothing's simple in Trenton. And we're still working really hard to get that over the finish line, as I mentioned. And then the last one is bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides. So neonicotinoids are a class of pesticides that are very effective at getting little critters out of gardens and lawns and things, but they're very pervasive in our environment and often get washed away and get wasted. And the ones that are left behind kill our bees. And as we know, we need bees to pollinate our food, and we need food to eat. And so our bee populations are collapsing. And you saw Kai hold up our Save the Bees sticker. We're very hopeful that we can get that done in this next month, and we can send that to the governor. So those are just a few things at the state level. If you want to take action on saving the bees, Cameron put a link in the chat while we're talking here. We don't mind if you multitask, and send a link to the sponsor in the assembly, thanking him for his leadership on passing the Save the Bees Act. It's important because New Jersey is a pretty pharmaceutical friendly state, and a lot of companies have their fingerprints or some of their corporate offices here in New Jersey, and we need to make sure we can overcome any opposition they might have, because it'll hurt their bottom line and reduce sales. So that's important. And then of course at the federal level, which we're going to talk about tonight, the Buildback Better Act. We had the infrastructure bill that got passed, but there's another portion of the president's agenda that helps tackle climate change, and that's the Buildback Better Act. And that's passed the House, and it's waiting to be taken up, which we hope in the next week or so it will be, to the Senate, so that we can send that to President Biden and really start to invest in the climate pollution reducing strategies that we need, and also things that are good for our health. So that's kind of a little bit of a framework to get us started here. What we've been up to at New Jersey LCV, kind of what's at stake going forward at the federal level. And I get to introduce you to my friend, who is a climate scientist, Dr. John Krasting, who works at NOAA in the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory in Princeton. He's also a lecturer in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Rutgers University and is a professor at Rutgers University and a scientist for NOAA as part of the Ocean and Cryosphere Division. His work focuses on developing and using numerical models to study the Earth's carbon climate cycles and interactions. He looks at feedback loops and at the variability. His primary interests as a climate scientist are studying and modeling climate carbon cycle interactions, the ocean's role in the climate system, including sea level rise and ocean acidification, and the development of climate models with a focus on the interannual variability and future climate change. So let's all take a moment to thank Dr. Krasting for joining us to speak with us this evening and some time to educate us a little bit about the climate crisis that we're seeing and what we all need to know so we can become better advocates in addressing the culprit, which is, quite frankly, us as humans. So with that, Dr. Krasting, I turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters, especially Cameron Ewan, for setting this up. We've been trying to schedule this for a while now, and I'm glad that we finally all got together this evening to talk about climate change. And I look forward to sharing some of the work that we do down the road in Princeton. A lot of people don't know about the work that's going on with climate within NOAA at Princeton here in our own state. So I think it's one of the gems that we have here in New Jersey when it comes to climate change. And I look forward to sharing that with you tonight. I guess maybe I'll say a few words about what I do and our laboratory first off. So the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory is part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. You may know of us, no pun intended, of the from the Weather Service angle. Probably our prominent presence is the National Weather Service and the local office down in Mount Holly, one of over 100 weather forecast offices around the United States. But NOAA is a multifaceted agency. We're involved in operations through the Weather Service and through the National Ocean Services and the National Marine Fisheries Service, but we also have a strong research and enforcement arm as well too. So I come from an office called the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Division at NOAA, where we are charged at creating research products that eventually will make their way into operations within the agency. Now, our laboratory used to be located down in Washington, D.C. In the 1950s, and we moved up here to Princeton in the 1960s to take advantage of the Institute for Advanced Studies being built at Princeton, which had massive computers at the time. And the reason being that numerical weather forecasting and numerical modeling needed to take advantage of that high performance computing capability that was being built at Princeton. And shortly after our arrival in the 1960s, my laboratory built the first coupled atmospheric ocean climate model that was used to make projections of climate change going forward. In fact, you may have seen some of the news recently in this fall with the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Suki Manabe from my laboratory for that achievement. So we carry on that legacy today of continuing to develop and refine cutting edge climate models that we can use to study the Earth system. Now, climate models are really cool because we can do science with them and ask what if questions about our climate and our Earth system in a scientific, rigorous setting. Now, where other scientists can take advantage of laboratories and do chemical and physical experiments in the lab, we don't have that luxury when we're studying the Earth system. But what we can do is, with this mathematical representation of the Earth, we can model some of these scenarios and ask these what if questions about what's driving climate change and how do we expect the climate to change in the future. So I work directly with the development of those coupled models, the atmosphere ocean development models, I was involved in the development of NOAA's first Earth system model, which is a comprehensive GCM global climate model that incorporates a carbon cycle involved in it. And I currently now work in the ocean development, pushing high resolution ocean simulations on the order of about 25-kilometer grid spacing, which is beyond state of the art for this, for our field. And we're trying to answer some hyper-local questions about how climate will change going forward in time. A little bit of my background, I haven't always been an oceanographer. I came into studying climate from the atmosphere realm. I'm a graduate of Rutgers University. I have a bachelor's and a PhD in atmospheric science. And a fun fact about myself is I used to be a TV weatherman for a while. I used to work up for Fox 5 and My 9 up in New York City, and Fox 29 down in Philadelphia. So a lot of people ask me, well, why'd you leave television, and why are you working for climate in a government agency? And the answer is it's that important of an issue. And I feel that with my training and my background, I have much more potential to impact our society going forward by really tackling these questions that we're going to be talking about tonight with climate.
Awesome. So in the very basic sense, like you use the word climate model, and that's something like we're all supposed to understand. So I'm trying to think as a layperson here. It obviously is using a lot of data. Is that historical data that then looks at other factors to predict the future? Tell us a little bit more on the simplistic, like how is a model built, and what are some of the basic building blocks that help it to predict the future? Because I think there's a lot of trust and faith we're putting in them to make plans for the future.
Yeah, certainly. It's a great question, Ed. So what we can think about a climate model being is, imagine we are able to divide up the entire Earth's surface into little grid boxes. Think of them as sort of maybe pixels on your television, right? All these little dots come together to give you a representation of the picture you're seeing. We have all of these grid boxes that cover the Earth. And in every one of those grid boxes, we describe the physics of the atmosphere, the ocean, the Earth system, and the sea ice by mathematical representations of the processes that are happening in all these different components. And at each grid point, we repeat these calculations over and over again. The grid boxes interact with one another to move weather systems across the country, for example. And we essentially integrate this forward in time under different forcing conditions, climate forcing conditions. So what might those forcings be? Well, changes in atmospheric greenhouse gases are obviously a main driver of it. We see natural variations such as changes in sunspots, solar cycles, volcanic eruptions, and aerosols play an important role too, actually cool our climate. So all these different forcings, we have the history of how they've evolved over the past, and we feed them to our climate model. We can reconstruct the temperature evolution of the past, for example. That's how we have faith in them. And then if we are able to come up with scenarios about how we think human behavior will play out over the next century, we can then translate that into the forcings that we put back into the model and then make a projection going forward in time.
And is there some sort of deviation that's looked at? Like you talked about, the 1960s was the time when the first computers were being used, models were being developed. Do we look back and say which models were good versus the reality that came in the decades preceding it? And if so, then how is that taken into account as you build new ones?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we're always adding the complexity and the resolution. We're always developing along these two axes. We're putting more processes into the model as we learn about them and we know that they're important for climate. And we make the spacing between these grid boxes or the resolution smaller, so we get more detail. Now, what's really fascinating, if we look back to some of the very simple models from the 1970s, as you've pointed out, we've had a remarkable ability to project from that early time period the evolution of the climate thus far. So when we look back at some of those early projections, say 50, 60 years ago, and we confront them with our observed changes of what have happened, we've done very well in our history of being able to simulate the evolution of the late 20th century climate. So we have a lot of faith. We started out from a good place, and we're continuing to grow with more complexity and higher resolution.
That's really helpful to know. And so as like people are looking at more storms, obviously like Hurricane Ida, most recently Henri, and the weeks preceding, it seems like we've got a long stretch since we've had some major weather event. What's causing these storms at its very basic level? How much more can we be looking for into the future for New Jersey specifically? Obviously, that's where we're located geographically. And then like a more general question, like what can we do to make them less frequent and intense?
All right, so let's start maybe with a little bit of context. So one of the things we like to look at within NOAA is track billion-dollar weather disasters. So this is a benchmark that we use that defines sort of a threshold for a major weather event. So far in 2021, there have been 18 climate and weather disasters around our country that have exceeded $1 billion. Now, when you take into account inflation, and you adjust for the consumer price index, the average over the last 30 years is 7 events. So we're on pace to being 2.5 to almost 3 times more than our average over the last 30 years, and just this year alone. And a lot of this includes Hurricane Ida, for example, that hit New Jersey. So back in August, we had widespread flooding across the state. We saw in New York City and New Jersey the highest level of flood emergencies that have ever been issued for this area from the National Weather Service. And this system that moved through alone, Hurricane Ida, cost us over $64 billion in damages. This has been the most expensive weather disaster in our nation so far this year. You can also look at tornadoes. We had Hurricane Henri, which came through our region in September. New Jersey this year has seen 13 confirmed tornado touchdowns in our region. The average for a typical year in New Jersey is 2. So that gives you a little bit of context. So things are changing around our state, and they seem to be accelerating in terms of the change. Now, you asked the question about, what can we do about it? And I think another question too is, well, how much is climate really getting involved here in the mix? And one of the analogies that a colleague of mine at Rutgers likes to use, Tony Broccoli, he likes to refer to this as what I call the spice analogy. So let me ask you a question. I'll turn the tables a bit, Ed. Ed, do you like to cook?
I love to cook.
What's your most intricate, complex recipe that you've cooked?
I am you don't know this, I don't think. I am a big fan of cooking Indian food, which requires a lot of spices. I have a massive spice rack.
So a lot of spice. Lots of things interact when you throw them into the pot there, right? That's a good example. The way you can think of climate change and the way it impacts these individual weather events is it's another spice from your spice rack being thrown into the pot. So at the end of the day, when you mix together that Indian food, it's a nice blend of everything, right? If it turns out right, no one thing really should be overwhelming, correct?
Yeah.
At this stage in the game, when we're dealing with climate change, climate is another spice that we've thrown into the mix that's changing our recipe. It's a little bit hard right now to fish out from all the natural variability that's going on in the system, what role climate change has had. Like we can't fully go back and look at Hurricane Ida and Hurricane Henri and quantify just yet what impact that has had, the climate change has had on those events, because it's in the pot with a whole lot of other spices. But as we add more and more of that spice to the pot, it's going to overwhelm the other things in the recipe. So we're getting to a stage now, I feel, where we're gonna start seeing the effects of climate change even more clearly than we are seeing today in these events.
And I think that brings us to like one of the pieces of legislation that's moving at the federal level, the Buildback Better Act, which would be the largest investment in our lifetime in addressing climate change and reducing greenhouse gases, which is mostly carbon dioxide. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. You know, how big do you think that is? And like, would it help us with the climate crisis in your experience? Is that something we should be, because we're working very hard with our membership and colleagues to get that going as I want to say a lifeline, but as an opportunity.
Yeah, I want to start off, I guess, by answering that question by saying, it's not really my place here to be commenting on the policy per se, and the views here are my own, are really my personal views and not those of NOAA. But what I will say is that we are at a juncture in the climate change path and the story that we're telling as a society where we really need strong leadership on climate domestically and internationally. Now, if we come back to the science and what the climate models tell us, is if we look at what all of the nations around the world have pledged for the Paris Agreement, and everyone were to faithfully meet their emissions reductions, we would still come up short of meeting the goal of keeping global average warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So just, you want to think about that even in the best case scenario of what we planned out 6 years ago, we're still going to come up short. We need to make some changes to our trajectory of carbon dioxide from a purely scientific perspective, if we want to make sure that we meet those adverse targets and make sure we avoid them.
Is that goal of like by 2030 on that trajectory for the 50% reductions also insufficient, is what you're saying? Because that's, we talk about two goals, like the 100% by 2035, I think Biden has, and then there's this 50% reductions of total greenhouse that New Jersey's on a path, thanks to Governor Murphy and the Global Warming Response Act, by 2030, so in the next 9 years, from 2006 levels. How does that relate to where we need to be? I mean, we're just one nation in a globe, but are we really doing our part?
Well, most of the studies that look at the global trajectory that indicate that as a world, we need to plateau carbon dioxide emissions within the next 10 years.
Okay. So reductions, I have to see where that line interacts. I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed with climate change. A lot of folks that support the work we do, it's one of the issues they care a lot about. I hear from them, they tell me, I don't know what I can do but support you because it feels so overwhelming. So I'm going to ask a more like sort of basic question. What can people do in their daily lives to help reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, sort of lower their carbon footprint, and help to address or reduce climate change? What are some of the things you think are some of the, I would almost ask you to rank them from the biggest things you can do to the things that have maybe less of an impact but feel good still?
Well, I think maybe to answer that question is that we have to look as a nation about where our carbon's coming from and where our contributions to climate change are coming from. So the EPA estimates that 29% of our emissions are coming from the transportation sector. So that means gasoline, diesel, transportation. That's one obvious area where we can think individually about and make choices about how we choose to get around. Not always easiest in New Jersey here, but things like public transportation, more fuel efficient vehicles, all will certainly help reduce the burden in that sector. Electricity production, that's 25% of our emissions as well too. And a lot of that comes from coal and natural gas. So, those two sectors alone account for more than half of the US total emissions of carbon. The good news is that since the late early 2000s, so the first decade of the century, we peaked in terms of US carbon emissions, and we've been declining since then. In fact, we've reduced about 15% off of our peak since that period. In contrast, we're seeing explosive growth in China and other developing nations. So they're beating us in terms of overall aggregate carbon emissions globally. But when you think about the per capita impact, the US by far has the highest per capita carbon footprint. So it really does come down to the individual level of how we all need to take some personal choices. And in bulk, that is gonna make an impact.
Yeah, and so what I'm sort of hearing is the work we did on the electric vehicles is important. So I'll just do a quick plug for that, because transportation being a big part. Get on public transportation. It makes sense in a lot of communities. If you can convert to an electric vehicle, it really makes sense. There's no sales tax in New Jersey now to buy an electric vehicle. So that's a savings of 6-point-something%. And then in addition, you get up to a $5,000 rebate, and you'll save $1,000 a year in energy costs. So rather than buying gasoline, you'll save about $1,000 over, per mile, or whatever you want to say, for the equivalent miles that you've traveled if you buy an electric vehicle. So if you're in the market for a new car, more models are coming online. That's something that really can make a huge difference. And then, in New Jersey, we're also a deregulated energy supplier. So you can actually make a choice on your energy bill in many communities, depending if you have something called energy aggregation, where you all kind of opted in to one energy provider, to go more renewable than the standard mix that may come on your electric bill. So if you haven't explored those options, you can go to the Clean Energy Program. I think it's cleanenergy.gov or .nj.gov. Maybe Cameron, you can look it up and put it in the chat. But there, to look at energy suppliers and make those choices for more renewables, solar and wind, and we'll be needing to put some of the wind in place. That's sort of slated in the state going forward. There's a lot of stuff in the Buildback Better Act that helps along these lines too, particularly electrification of transportation, given it's such a big part of what we do. It's even worse when we're sitting in traffic. I think during the pandemic, everyone was amazed at how clean the air was. We were seeing reports about that. It really gives you a sense of how much humans impact their environment, how much we impact the world around us. So with that, I kind of want to transition to there are still skeptics that say, climate change is cyclical. It has nothing to do with humans. Humans are not a cause. Carbon pollution is not a greenhouse gas. We breathe out carbon dioxide. What do we should all be not on the planet anymore? You probably see a lot of this. You're a professional in this area. How do you respond? How should folks help to message in situations like that? What can we do to bring folks along to understand that we're not blaming each other, but we are trying to get a shared responsibility to provide a solution to a problem that we've caused? So what do you do with those deniers?
We need to shed a little bit of light on the changes that are happening around our state and around our nation. I think if you go down to the Jersey Shore and you ask people who live in our coastal communities, you'll probably find people who've maybe changed their tune about some of what you're talking about. I'll just give a real brief story. In the 1950s, Atlantic City would experience one high tide flooding event on average per year. So one day out of the year, you would get a real bad flood that would fill the streets of Atlantic City. In the last 5 years, we're averaging 8 a year. So you've gone from 1 day to 8 in the last half century or so. And that really impacts your life. When you're trying to plan your day around picking up your kids from school or going to the store, and you're reading the tide charts to find out when high tide is, and you're not used to doing that has an impact on you. Just to give you a perspective where we're going with that scenario, a New Jersey Science and Technology Advisory Panel report that was commissioned by Rutgers projects that number of high tide flooding days increasing to 17 to 75 days by 2030. That's how rapid the change is projected to change. And that could be as high as 45 to 255 days by 2070. So more often than not, you're going to get flooding in Atlantic City by the end of the century. So you have to live some of these changes and these experiences to really appreciate what's happening. And I think we have to do a better job of shining light on what's happening around us for those who maybe aren't living at the shore, for in this case, and seeing it. We have to trust science as well too. You know, I often wonder as a representative of the government if there's some inherent distrust with what I tell people. You know, people have their own personal views and opinions that get wrapped into what is legitimate information that's trying to be conveyed. So I think we have a lot to do in terms of science education, science literacy, and really restoring some trust in our projections and what we're trying to communicate to the public. So it's a challenge, Ed. It really is a difficult thing to try to get this message across to people who are still skeptical.
I mean, to that end, sort of in your experience or given the work that you do in the next 5 or 10 years, like what would you like to see happen if you could, you know, in Dr. Krasting's world, you know, getting into that area where we're making things and making amends? What does that look like?
Globally, we have to plateau emissions by 2030. The world has to stop the increase of greenhouse gases by 2030. And we have to have a way of removing carbon dioxide by the middle of this century. So that, I mean, to me, that is our pathway. And that's well rooted in what our climate models are showing. It's virtually inconsistent to keep us below the thresholds of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius globally without meeting that pathway.
And tell me again, just for all of us, if we don't meet the goals that you just described, in your best estimation, based on these models that go back now 50 years plus, what would things look like?
Well, you start to see effects in our most sensitive aspects of the climate system. Sea level rise will become more of an issue, and not just in the near future. Sea level rise is something that builds out over time. You know, the ocean has a very long memory in terms of heat uptake. So emissions today, you know, will last in the ocean for centuries to come. We look at impacts to marine ecosystems, coral degradation. You know, all that has an economic impact as well too. You know, many communities along the Northeast coast are dependent on the fishing industry. So there are many impacts of highly sensitive canaries in the coal mine to climate that you know are going to be the bellwethers if we don't meet these targets.
So one question I have, you know, as we're kind of going through here, ocean acidification, coral bleaching. Can you talk a little bit about those? Because we talk, you know, in climate change, we're thinking about how does it impact us, you know, sunny day flooding. It's crazy for me to think by 2050 or 2070 that Atlantic City is almost going to be underwater every day. I mean, that's basically what you described. And that's a human impact to us, but there are a lot of things we depend on. The ocean, my understanding, gives us more oxygen than land, right? It's cleaning up and doing photosynthesis in a way that's very a big part of what we depend on. Yet the ocean is dying because it's becoming acidified. Our coral reefs are bleaching and the ecosystems that are around them. Can you talk more about what's happening there and why people aren't talking more about it? What do they need to know?
You know, what happens with carbon dioxide when it enters the ocean, it competes for carbonate in the oceans, or bicarbonate. And that's used by so many marine ecosystems to build shells, right? So all these critters in the ocean build their shells out of carbonate. And when you put more carbon dioxide into the ocean, it increases the competition for that carbonate. So there's not as much left over for these little critters that form the base of the food web in the ocean. So when you start talking about other species of fish that, graze on that and the whole food pyramid is
Places
effectively.
where that's needed, then I'm happy to step in. But there's going to be some staggering, right? I mean, you're not all.
Issue here.
I mean, I.
Okay, we're all right.
Okay. So yeah, the point I was just making there is that it impacts the very base of the food chain, and it works its way up from there. So many other organisms that rely on that for feeding, that may be part of our food supply even, will feel the effect.
And can we turn that back?
Once you get carbon and heat into the ocean, it's extremely difficult to get it out. I think that's what people need to appreciate about the ocean's role in climate. Carbon dioxide will cycle through the atmosphere relatively quickly, but once it gets into the ocean, it's there for decades to centuries.
And
we talk about aspects of climate change that are not reversible, these so-called tipping points, and ocean acidification is one of them.
And are we monitoring that? Or I'm sure you're monitoring that. And tell us a little bit about what that looks like as well.
Yeah, we're monitoring. I'm involved in some active research now in ocean acidification. We're projecting changes up in the Arctic. Arctic Ocean is probably the most prone ocean to ocean acidification. And some of our projections are by mid-century that we will see corrosive surface waters, which are very harmful to marine life. And that is under even low to moderate climate change scenarios.
And there's a great movie called Chasing Coral. If folks want to learn more about what's happening in our oceans. I think sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say. That kind of wraps up my questions. Folks, we really want to say thank you for joining us. Cameron has some closing thoughts. Personal, Dr. Krasting, I want to say thank you so much for taking time. I hope you can come back again. This field is one that is constantly having new reports that come out that can often be, I don't want to say confusing, but need a little bit of a explainer to help us understand. And then we can become better advocates for the policies that we need to shift away from the ones that got us into the situation we're in. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the invitation. I'm more than happy to come back and talk about any current climate events that come up.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here for our closing remarks. Thank you, Ed, for those questions, and special thank you to everyone for coming this evening, and a special thank you to you, Dr. Krasting, for being here. I know I learned a lot. I hope you all enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And just on that note of protecting our oceans and our lands, if you want to protect our future, you can sign a petition to send a letter to your member of Congress urging them to pass the Buildback Better Act, which will go into the chat now. If you plan on taking action, please just put a thumbs up or turn your camera on and show us a thumbs up so we know that you're going to be taking action to help fight climate change. And then once again, thank you all for coming. Just as a heads up, we're going to be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow, which will include the recording of the event in case you want to watch it again and other ways to stay involved. Have a great night, and we hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Dr.